The Victorian Age, a period of great transformation in British history. Political reform, technological innovation, social change, and great prosperity for some, and terrible poverty for many, many others. And at the end of the 19th century, there was a great shake-up in British society, with what was known as the Great Agricultural Depression. The Depression lasted from the 1870s to almost 1900, and in essence it brought a dramatic plunge in grain prices, which threatened collapse on British agriculture, which at that time was the largest economic sector. It was born of a changing global economy and brought farmer bankruptcies, changes in how farmers ran their businesses, and an ever-building dissatisfaction with the landowning aristocracy. There were three main factors that led to the Great Agricultural Depression. Probably the most visible in Britain at that time was the weather. Farmers regarded 1879 as a shockingly bad year, and the years preceding it brought wet summers that rotted grain in the fields and left little for harvest. The weather in the 1880s was better for agriculture, but the 1890s brought a series of droughts. A journalist wrote in 1895, "The agricultural outlook is rather gloomy at present. The drought is becoming more severe, grass is being burnt up everywhere." The severity of these weather events ravaged crops and threatened the livelihoods of the farmers. While British farmers struggled, grain imports began to flood the market with little government regulation. Earlier in the century, Parliament had made a decisive shift towards the deregulation of trade. They had repealed the Corn Laws of 1815, which had applied tariffs to imported grain in the hopes that it would encourage grain providers to purchase from British farmers. It also safeguarded the power of the rural aristocracy, who owned most of the agricultural land in Britain. The Corn Laws guaranteed that their tenants had a market for their produce, meaning that they would be able to pay their rent. But by the 1840s, various groups began to campaign for the repeal of the laws, arguing that it would reduce the price of wheat, which was the everyday staple. Critics of the anti-Corn Law groups predicted that there would be an immediate crash in British corn production and agricultural wages after the repeal. But the Corn Laws got repealed anyway in 1846, and you know what happened? Not much. The general wheat prices didn't really change, but it set the stage for what happened in the 1870s. In the 1870s, while agriculture was failing in Britain due to the weather, it was booming in the United States. This was in large part thanks to the U.S. Homestead Act of 1862, which encouraged independent settlers to claim plots of up to 160 acres of prairie lands that had previously been used by indigenous communities. These settlers were meant to develop their plot for farming, and over the next 20 years, the prairies transformed into a massive farmland. The railways followed this westward expansion, and the farmers began to sell their produce on the global market. When this flood of cheap American grain hit the global market, the unregulated British economy, already burdened with terrible harvest, saw the price of grain plummet. The people in Britain hit hardest by this were those working on the farms, landowning farmers, tenant farmers, and agricultural laborers, and they began to struggle to pay for their most basic needs. In England and Wales in 1877, at the very start of the Depression, 477 farmers declared bankruptcy. 1 year later, in 1878, that number rose to 815. And by 1879, it was 1,430. Over the next couple decades, this yearly number of bankruptcies continued to increase. Most of the bankruptcies were concentrated in southeast England, where there was the largest concentration of wheat farmers. So there were variations across England and Wales in how badly farmers felt the effects of the Depression. According to observers at the time, the Depression was much less severe in Wales than it was in England. One thing that contributed to that was the Welsh practice of mixed farming. Most Welsh farmers didn't depend solely on wheat to sell to market. In any case, wheat didn't grow very well in much of the country. So most farmers focused on oats and barley, and about 1/7 of agricultural land was used to grow root vegetables, which were used as fodder for livestock. In addition to their grains and vegetables, many Welsh farmers were also pastoralists. They had large herds of sheep or cattle that they would take to graze on the mountain and sell for wool, meat, and dairy products. These different kinds of produce meant that when grain prices plummeted, Welsh farmers were still able to gain a profit from their other produce. The Welsh dairy industry was also growing at this time. This was supported by both the increased population of the cities and the expansion of the railways. Some farmers were moving to farms better suited to dairy production. Others were moving to areas with better access to the railway network. And then you get members of rural farming communities moving to the towns and big cities. One of my ancestors, John Watkin Davis, was one of the many rural Welsh farmers who ended up in London at the end of the century to work as a dairyman. For him, it ended up being good business that made him enough money to send his children to school and get them good office jobs in insurance and the government. So there were still opportunities available for those who already had the means to access them. As for the people who worked the land as agricultural laborers, many of them lost their jobs. Agricultural laboring didn't pay particularly well in the 19th century anyway. Laborers were working up to 100 hours a week for as little as 9 shillings, which was 50% less than industrial laborers made. And they often lived in terrible conditions. A royal commission in 1892 wrote that laborers might sleep in the body of an old cart filled with straw, and where beds are provided, the bedclothes are sometimes washed only once in 6 months. No sanitary utensils are supplied, and the men often went to bed in their working clothes without taking even their boots off. As the Depression deepened, across Wales there was this dramatic decrease in the total amount of people working as agricultural laborers, and where they ended up finding work was in the urban factories, which had their own set of dangers. So the kind of distress that people felt really depended on where they lived and what social class they belonged to. And the stark differences across social classes was one of the things that came to the forefront during the Depression. In Wales, the aristocracy owned most of the agricultural land, and it was their tenant farmers who bore the brunt of the Depression. At a meeting of the Welsh Land Commission of 1894 to 1896, George Williams, a tenant farmer from Hayston in Pembrokeshire, told the commission, "I say the landlords began in the year 1885 to believe that there was a little depression in agriculture. The real depression in agriculture began in 1879, and in that 1 year alone, I gave my whole labor and the labor of my family for nothing, and we never made a shilling of rent during that year, and we would never recover from that." He continues saying that the real secret of it is, the landowners have never been brought to believe the depression we are under. And Williams was very right. The difference in lifestyle between the rich and the poor really impacted how they interpreted this time of depression. When the aristocracy did start to believe that there was an agricultural depression, some of them had this misguided notion that they were all in it together. A letter written by Lord Cragoe, who held a large estate in Carmarthenshire, really highlights this. He wrote in 1885 about the agricultural depression, saying it will be felt by all classes, the laborers who will lose their employment, as well as the landowners, who must deny themselves many things they have become accustomed to. The interesting thing about this quote is how Lord Cragoe believed that losing your job and having slightly fewer luxuries were at all comparable. But many tenant farmers had a good understanding of the great divide between them and their landlords, and they channeled it into political agitation. And one of the changes that the tenant farmers began to fight for was wide-scale rent reduction. They were holding meetings against the wishes of their landlords and writing manifestos like this one that was published in the South Wales Echo in 1885. They wrote that in order to meet the Great Depression of stock and crops, a general reduction of rents must become imperative. If a general reduction of 30% be made on land, the owners at the present time would be as well off as they were 10 years ago. The reduction, therefore, would inflict no hardship on proprietors of land, since the cost of living and prices of commodities have already been reduced to that extent. Such a reduction would have been a lifeline for the tenant farmers, but the response from the landlords varied. Many of them refused a rent reduction, especially in the early years of the Depression. What the landlords preferred were rent abatements, where the rent would stay the same, but farmers could individually approach their landlord and beg for a percentage of the rent to be returned. From the perspective of the tenants, this would have left them at the whims of the landlord, and in any case, many of them viewed these wealthy, upper-class, absentee landlords as unapproachable. Effectively, rent abatements would do little to better the lives of the tenant farmers. It's important to note that some rent reductions did end up happening. In 1896, a notice in the South Wales Daily News stated that Lord Tredegar on Monday announced rent reductions of 30% to tenants on his extensive estates in Breconshire and Carmarthenshire, owing to the continued agricultural depression. Some landlords tried other ways to lessen the depression, like Mr. Campbell Davis of Neuadd Fawr in Killicum. In 1886, he began offering his tenants free, unlimited access to lime, which was a product made from burning chalk or limestone, and when it's added to the fields, it neutralizes acidic soil, which increases the yields. While it took a lot of work on the part of the tenant farmers and campaigners, many other landlords eventually did reduce their rents and implement other changes. One of the groups not mentioned in the sources that I found about the agricultural depression were the urban workers, and how they fared through this time. You might think that if grain prices plummeted during the Depression, then the price of bread went down too, and there would be better access to food. But one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. But if it did, this might have been a really good time for urban workers, even though their rural farming contemporaries suffered. We can look for some answers in the average price of bread in London during the Depression. A 4-pound loaf cost between 8 and 5 pence. There were other years prior where the price was this low, but what characterizes this period most is that there weren't these extreme differences in price from one year to the next. The prices reached a kind of equilibrium, at least in London. Less uncertainty in your food prices is always a good thing. But beyond whether it was a good time or a bad time and for whom, the agricultural depression was overall a transformative time. It encouraged trends in migration that had already been happening of people moving from the countryside to the cities. It promoted workers organizing to make demands on the aristocracy who hoarded their wealth and land. And there was a dramatic shift in what groups held the majority of the wealth and power in the country, as merchants and manufacturers began to outpace the traditional aristocracy in amassing wealth, and British agriculture continued to decline. The Welsh Land Commission actually suggested a remedy to the depression, which was to reinstate regulations on food and imports. And in many European countries, that was the route taken, and those countries suffered less overall. However, the Commission also wrote that there seemed to be little political will to put these regulations into place. And so widespread relief didn't really come to British farmers, and these changes continued into the 20th century. But I hope this video has given you a good sense of the ways different groups in Britain were affected by the agricultural depression. And if you had ancestors in Britain at this time, it might be interesting to consider where they fit into this story. Like many others, most of my ancestors were leaving farming, settling near Swansea and taking up factory work at that time. And if you'd like to learn more about migration in Wales, why not check out this next video?